right, so if you're thinking about the categorical imperative like this is a really rough way to approach morality. Really counterintuitive way to approach morality. Usually when I think about morality, I think about how we navigate our way through the relationships that we have with other people, the interactions that we have with other people, and the categorical imperative is requiring me to delve so deep into the logical properties of particular actions to determine their logical consistency. This just doesn't seem like a viable way to approach ethics. It's just too counterintuitive. And so if you find yourself responding to the categorical imperative that way, take comfort in the fact that you're not the only one. Many of Kant's critics responded the exact same way. In fact, they responded so vocally in the exact same way that Kant kind of got frustrated. He says, okay. You didn't like that version of the categorical imperative. I'll give you another one. It's still the categorical imperative, but it's going to be different. But it's not really the categorical imperative, okay? But what Kant says is, look, I'm going to talk about the categorical imperative now in terms of a means-ends principle, okay? And what I mean by a means-end principle is this. We're going to start with the assumption that humans are a source of values in the world. That if there weren't humans, we wouldn't have values, and if we don't have values, nothing would be of worth, okay? Now, what Kant means by that is this. Think about the experience you're having right now. It's a very coherent experience. You are listening to me talk. You're understanding the words that I'm saying. You're looking at the screen. You're watching my hands flit around. And this is a very organized experience. It's an experience that ignores the probably infinite amount of stimuli that is surrounding you at this moment. The color of the paint on your wall, the sound of your refrigerator turning off and on, whatever's going on outside your window. There's a whole bunch of other things that you could be focused on right now, but you're not. And you're not because you're bringing to your immediate moment a set of values that constrains or maybe even constructs out of all of the stimulus around you a particular experience. You wouldn't be having this experience if you weren't able to bring some values to it that told you where to put your eyes, where to put your ears, where to put your concentration, and so forth. And so Kant says this is an indication that we are a source of values. We create, we define what has worth in the world by selecting out from all of the things in the world, particular things to pay attention to. And Kant says, well, that means that humans are a necessary condition of worth. We don't operate on just instinct, where our eyes go and our ears go wherever our instincts tell them to go. We choose out of all of the stimuli where to put our eyes, where to put our ears. We make these choices freely. So we're a necessary condition of worth. And as necessary conditions of worth, we're back to Kant's dignity. We possess worth ourselves. And what this means in particular for Kant, that's very important, is that we have intrinsic, not just instrumental value. Okay, so we have instrumental value. We have value as a kind of tool or an instrument that can be used by others to achieve their ends. Like I have instrumental value to you as your teacher. I can be useful to you, just like you have instrumental value to me. You can be useful to me. Without you, I don't have a job. Okay, but we also, Kant says, have intrinsic value. We have value that stretches far beyond or goes way deeper than our instrumental value. We have inherent or intrinsic worth. Okay? And so Kant says this leads to an ethical principle. And this is what Kant says. Act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person, and that's going to be important, or in that of another, always as an end and never as a means only. Okay. Super important point here from Kant, one of the clearest things he ever wrote. Okay, so Kant is saying that because human beings have intrinsic value, we can never disregard that intrinsic value. That even when we're interacting with another person who's helping us achieve our own ends, we have to recognize that they have value to themselves as their own ends, and we can't just treat people as tools. So one of the more impassioned response I get from students is from those who have worked or working in the service industry, like serving coffee or at a bar or a clerk at a grocery store. And I'll ask them, like, does it ever bother you when you're at work and somebody comes to the door and you're like, hey, how are you doing today? How's your day going? And they don't respond to that. They just bark out an order. You go, you fill their coffee, you come back and you say, hey, is there anything else I can get for you? Great, that'll be this amount. They hand you the money and you say, thanks, have a great day. And at no point in the interaction has that customer ever really reciprocated any of the gestures that you've been offering to them. And what students will say is, this is so grating, so irritating when we get treated like this. And I ask them, well, why? You're just doing your job. And the response is always the same. And that is because they're treating me like a thing, right? I'm not asking them to do me any favors, but if I say hello to you and I ask you how your day's going, you can at least respond to my question. And it's even better if you ask me how my day's going. When I say thank you for coming in, you should say, you're welcome. Thank you for serving me my coffee, is the response, right? And what they're saying is, I don't want to be treated like a human coffee machine. I don't want to be treated like a thing. I want to be treated as somebody who has his or her own life, who has his or her own value that goes far beyond my value as someone who can bring you a cup of coffee. Okay, so you might think about how Kant was going to respond to this. He's going to say, yeah, if you regard that barista as simply a human robot serving you coffee, you're violating this means-ends principle. You're treating them as a means only and not as an end in themselves. You might think about how this applies to the Cookie Monster girls. Were they acknowledging the intrinsic worth of the little Girl Scout that they stole the money from? What about the torture scenarios that we reviewed in our utilitarianism discussions? When we torture someone for information, are we treating them as an ends in themselves, or are we just treating them as a thing to be used towards our own ends? Think about suicide. Kant would say, if you commit suicide, you're treating yourself, your bodily self, as a means only and not as an end. You're treating your body as a tool that you can use to get rid of some suffering that you're enduring. Okay? So what Kant is going to say is, when you go to the grocery store, and that clerk asks you, did you find everything you need? Are you having a good day? Respond back, acknowledge they're a human being. Now, you might think about how we would extend this out to a case like our German friends that engaged in cannibalism. Were they regarding themselves and each other as means only? Or, based on the details that I gave you and Sandel gave you, did they regard each other as an ends in themselves as well? And you can see here that there was some niceties that took place between these two. They had dinner, the relationship was a consensual one and so forth. But in this situation, maybe the niceties that are required are greater than our interactions with the barista and the grocery store clerk. And you might think about how this relates to other issues like sex surrogacy or prostitution and so forth. If someone engages in a relationship with a prostitution and they don't regard them as an intrinsically valuable person in and of themselves, they're violating the means-ends principle. But is having the kind of exchange of niceties that we have with a barista going to be adequate to acknowledge the intrinsic value of the prostitute? In other words, you go to the prostitute and it's like, hey, how are you doing? I'm great. How are you? I'm fine. Okay, let's go. Is that enough? Or is the nature of the relationship that you're having with the prostitute one that has a greater intensity of intimacy compared to the barista interaction that requires a more substantial engagement with the prostitute, with you as the client of the prostitute? In other words, do you have to know this other person and something about them to a degree greater than you need to know about the barista in order to really acknowledge their humanity, their dignity, their intrinsic worth as a person in this particular dynamic?